The rain was a relentless curtain, drenching Julian's thin frame as he stumbled through the alley, his pulse hammering like a war drum. He clutched the bloodied knife, its weight a cruel reminder of the choice he'd just made. Behind him, the echo of Caleb's voice, low, desperate, pleading, still burned in his ears. New York City, 2025, was a beast of a place, its pulse thrumming through concrete and steel, indifferent to the lives it swallowed. Julian Kane, 25, had spent his life running from his father's fists, from the whispers of his own heart, from the truth he buried deep. But tonight, in this rain-soaked alley, there was no more running. Caleb Ward, his bodyguard, his shadow, his unspoken love, had followed him into the dark, as he always did. Julian's sneakers slipped on the wet pavement, and he caught himself against a brick wall, the knife clattering to the ground. His breath hitched as he heard Caleb's heavy footsteps behind him. "Julian, stop." Caleb's voice was raw, not with anger, but with something deeper, fear. Maybe, or something Julian didn't dare name. He turned, chest heaving, to face the man who'd been his protector for 2 years. Caleb, 27, was all sharp angles and quiet strength, his blonde hair plastered to his forehead, blue eyes cutting through the storm. He wasn't just a bodyguard. He was the one person who saw Julian, truly saw him, beyond the scars and the secrets. And now, Julian had betrayed him. "I didn't mean to," Julian whispered, his voice breaking. The blood on his hands wasn't his own, and the weight of that truth threatened to crush him. Caleb stepped closer, unafraid, his gaze steady despite the chaos. "I know," Caleb said softly, his hand reaching out but stopping short. "But you can't keep running from this. From us." The us hung heavy in the air, a fragile thread stretched across lifetimes. Julian's dreams had been haunted for years by visions of another Lithia life where he was someone else, someone cruel, someone who locked Caleb in a cage of duty and desire. In those dreams, Caleb was his guard, bound by loyalty, his heart chained by Julian's own selfishness. And now, in this life, the roles had reversed. Caleb was the one keeping Julian tethered, not with chains, but with something far stronger. Julian's knees buckled, and he sank to the ground, the rain washing the blood from his hands, but not the guilt from his soul. Caleb knelt beside him, close enough that Julian could feel the warmth of his breath. "I'm not letting you go," Caleb said, his voice a vow. "Not this time." Their story began 2 years ago, in a penthouse overlooking Manhattan, where Julian was the son of a media mogul, a man whose empire was built on lies and fear. Julian's father, Richard Kane, was a titan, his name synonymous with power and ruthlessness. Julian, his only heir, was a pawn in his game, groomed to inherit a legacy he despised. Caleb had been hired to protect him, but from the start, it was clear he was more than muscle. He was a former Marine, quiet and observant, with a past he rarely spoke of. His presence was a constant, a shield against the world and against Julian's own self-destruction. The first time their hands brushed, it was an accident, a fleeting touch, while Caleb handed Julian a glass of water. But the spark it ignited was anything but accidental. Julian, who'd spent years hiding his attraction to men, felt his carefully built walls tremble. Caleb, ever professional, kept his distance, but his eyes betrayed him. They lingered too long, softened too much. Their connection grew in stolen moments, late-night talks in the penthouse, shared silences in the back of a chauffeured car, the way Caleb's hand would hover when Julian stumbled, as if he could catch his soul before it fell. But Julian's life was a minefield. His father's disapproval was a shadow over everything, and the city's underbelly rival tycoons, shady deals, and whispered threats kept Caleb on edge. Tonight, though. Everything had shattered. Julian had been dragged into one of his father's deals, a meeting with a man named Victor Crane, a predator in a tailored suit. Victor had made it clear what he wanted, Julian, not just as a business pawn, but as something more personal, more vile. When Julian refused, things turned ugly. The knife, the blood, the alley, it was all a blur. But Julian had fought back. And now, he was a fugitive in his own life. Caleb's hand finally found Julian's, grounding him in the storm. "We'll figure this out," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "But you have to trust me." Julian wanted to. God, he wanted to. But trust was a luxury he'd never known. Not in this life, and not in the one that haunted his dreams. In that past life, he'd been the one to bind Caleb, to trap him in a role that broke them both. Now, Caleb's loyalty, his love, was the chain keeping Julian from falling apart. "I don't know how," Julian admitted, his voice barely audible over the rain. Caleb's grip tightened. "Then let me show you." They stayed there, two figures in the rain, bound by something neither could fully name. The city roared around them, but for the first time, Julian felt like he wasn't alone. Caleb was his anchor, his cage, his freedom. And as the rain fell, washing away the blood and the fear, Julian knew this was only the beginning. The safe house smelled of damp wood and stale coffee, a cramped apartment tucked above a Brooklyn deli. Julian sat on a sagging couch, his hands still trembling as Caleb locked the door behind them. The city's pulse felt distant here, but the weight of what they'd done pressed in like the walls. Caleb moved with purpose, checking the windows, his broad shoulders tense under his soaked jacket. Julian watched him, the guilt gnawing deeper. "I didn't mean to drag you into this," he said, his voice hoarse. "You shouldn't be here." Caleb turned, his blue eyes sharp. "Where else would I be?" The question wasn't just about Noah, it was about every moment they'd shared. Every time Caleb had chosen to stay. Julian looked away, his gaze falling on the knife, now cleaned and resting on the table. The memory of Victor's blood was still vivid, the way it had pooled on the warehouse floor. Julian hadn't meant to kill him. He'd only wanted to escape, to stop Victor's hands from reaching for him. But the blade had found its mark, and now they were both running not just from the law, but from Richard Kane's wrath. Caleb sat beside him, close enough that their knees brushed. "Tell me what happened," he said, his tone gentle but firm. Julian hesitated, the words caught in his throat. How could he explain the panic? The way Victor's leer had unearthed memories of his father's cruelty, of a life where he'd been nothing but a possession. "I couldn't let him touch me," Julian finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "Not like that. Not again." Caleb's jaw tightened, but he didn't press. Instead, he reached for Julian's hand, his calloused fingers warm against Julian's cold skin. "You're not alone in this," he said. "Not anymore." The words stirred something in Julian, a memory that wasn't his own. In his dreams, he'd seen Caleb in another time, another Placia medieval fortress, stone walls, and iron bars. Julian had been a prince, cruel and possessive, and Caleb his loyal guard, bound by duty and something deeper. Julian had kept him close, too close, using power to cage a heart he couldn't fully claim. The guilt of that life bled into this one, making every touch from Caleb feel like an apology Julian didn't deserve. They spent the night piecing together a plan. Caleb's contacts from his Marine days could get them fake IDs, maybe a way out of the city. But Richard Kane's reach was long, his resources vast. Julian knew his father would hunt them, not just for the murder, but for the defiance. Julian was supposed to be his legacy, his puppet. And Caleb, Caleb was a threat. A man who saw too much, cared too much. As dawn broke, painting the room in muted grays, Julian found himself watching Caleb sleep. He was sprawled in a chair, his face softened in a way Julian rarely saw. The sight tugged at something deep inside him, a longing he'd buried under years of fear. He wanted to reach out, to trace the line of Caleb's jaw, but he stopped himself. What right did he have to want? After everything. The day brought new dangers. Caleb's phone buzzed with a message from an old friend. A warning: Richard's men were already scouring the city. They had to move, and fast. Caleb packed a bag with essentials cash, burner phones, a gun Julian didn't know he had. "We'll head upstate," Caleb said. "There's a place we can lie low." Julian nodded, but his mind was elsewhere, caught in the dreams that felt too real. In that past life, he'd locked Caleb away, not in a cell, but in a role that suffocated him. Now, Caleb was the one binding Julian not with force, but with loyalty, with love. The irony was a knife in his chest. They slipped out of the safe house as the city woke, blending into the morning crowd. Julian kept his head down, his heart racing every time a car slowed nearby. Caleb stayed close, his presence a shield, but Julian couldn't shake the feeling that he was dragging Caleb into a cage of his own making. By nightfall, they were on a bus headed north, the city's lights fading behind them. Julian stared out the window, the weight of Caleb's arm brushing against his own. "Why do you stay?" he asked suddenly, the question spilling out before he could stop it. Caleb's eyes met his, steady and sure. "Because you're worth it," he said simply. "You always have been." The words hit Julian like a tidal wave, stirring memories of a life where he'd failed to be worthy. He wanted to believe Caleb, to trust in this fragile thing between them. But the past both lives loomed large, and Julian knew the road ahead would test them in ways neither could predict. The cabin was a relic, tucked deep in the Adirondacks, its wooden beams groaning under the weight of time. Julian stood at the window, watching snow dust the pines, his breath fogging the glass. Caleb's presence behind him was a quiet anchor, but the silence between them was heavy with unspoken truths. They'd been here for 3 days, hidden from the world, but the isolation only amplified Julian's fears. Richard's men were out there, closing in. Caleb had caught a glimpse of a black SUV on the road yesterday, too sleek for these backwoods. They were being hunted, and Julian couldn't shake the feeling that he was the bait, luring Caleb into a trap. "You're thinking too loud," Caleb said, his voice cutting through the quiet. He was cleaning his gun at the kitchen table, his movements precise, practiced. Julian turned, meeting those blue eyes that seemed to see right through him. "I'm thinking we're screwed," Julian admitted, his voice rough. "My father won't stop. He never does." Caleb set the gun down, his gaze unwavering. "Then we don't stop either." It was that simple for Caleb. Always had been. Julian envied his clarity, the resolve. But for him, every step forward felt like wading through the ghosts of his past lives. The dreams were relentless now, vivid and cruel. He saw himself as that prince again, locking Caleb in a tower, his loyalty a chain Julian wielded without care. The shame of it burned, because in this life, Caleb's devotion was no less binding, and Julian was no less unworthy. They spent their days planning, mapping escape routes, and rationing supplies. Caleb taught Julian how to handle the gun, his hands steadying Julian's trembling ones. Their fingers brushed, lingered, and for a moment, the world was just the two of them, the cold metal of forgotten weight. Julian's heart raced, not from fear, but from the warmth of Caleb's touch, the way it grounded him in a way nothing else could. That night, they sat by the fire, the crackle of wood filling the silence. Julian traced the scars on his knuckles, relics of his father's temper. "Did you ever want to walk away?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "From me? From all of this?" Caleb leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, firelight dancing in his eyes. "Every day?" he said honestly. "But I never could. Not then. Not now." The words stirred something in Julian, a memory of that other life where Caleb had stayed, even when it broke him. "I don't deserve you," Julian said, the confession spilling out like blood. Caleb's hand found his, strong and sure. "You don't get to decide that," he said. "I do." The moment stretched, fragile and electric. Julian wanted to lean in, to close the distance, but fear held him back. Fear of his father, of the law, of the past that haunted him. But Caleb's gaze was a lifeline, pulling him from the abyss. The next morning, danger found them. A crack of a branch outside snapped Caleb into action. He grabbed the gun, motioning for Julian to stay low. Through the window, Julian saw figures moving in the trees. 2 men, armed, their faces obscured. Caleb's voice was calm, but his eyes were steel. "Stay here. I'll handle it." Julian's heart pounded as Caleb slipped outside, silent as a shadow. Minutes stretched like hours, each sound a rustle, a shout whisking the knife of fear in Julian's chest. When Caleb finally returned, his jacket was torn, blood on his knuckles. "They're gone," he said, his voice tight. "For now?" Julian rushed to him, checking for wounds, his hands shaking. "You're hurt," he said, his voice breaking. Caleb caught his wrists, holding him still. "I'm fine," he said, but his eyes said more relief. Fear. Something deeper. "I told you. I'm not letting you go." The words were a vow, a chain, a promise. Julian felt the weight of both lives pressing in. The past where he'd caged Caleb and the present where Caleb chose to stay. As they stood there, the snow falling outside, Julian realized he was no longer running. Not from Caleb, not from himself. The cabin felt smaller each day, the walls closing in as Julian's dreams grew darker. He woke gasping. The image of Caleb chained in a stone cell burned into his mind. In that past life, Julian's cruelty had been a cage. And now, in this life, his guilt was no less confining. Caleb noticed the change. The way Julian's eyes darted. The way he flinched at sudden sounds. "You're not sleeping," Caleb said one morning, his voice low as he handed Julian a mug of coffee. The concern in his eyes was a weight Julian couldn't bear. "I keep seeing you," Julian admitted, staring into the steam. "In another life. I hurt you." He stopped, the words too heavy. Caleb sat across from him, his silence an invitation. "Tell me," he said finally. Julian's throat tightened. He spoke of the dreams, the fortress, the prince, the guard bound by loyalty and love. "I was a monster," he said, his voice breaking. "I kept you close because I couldn't let you go, but I never let you choose." Caleb listened, his face unreadable. When Julian finished, Caleb leaned forward, his voice steady. "That wasn't you. Not this you." But Julian wasn't so sure. The parallels were too stark, the way he'd leaned on Caleb these past years. The way he'd let Caleb risk everything for him. Was he still caging him? Even now? Their fragile peace shattered that afternoon. A burner phone buzzed with a message from Caleb's contact. Richard Kane had put a bounty on their heads. The hunters weren't just his father's men now. They were mercenaries, drawn by money and blood. Caleb's jaw tightened as he read the message, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his side. We need to move, he said, already packing. Tonight. Julian's heart sank. He'd brought this on them. On Caleb. I should turn myself in, he said, the words tasting like ash. This is my mess. Caleb spun on him, his eyes blazing. Don't you dare, he said, his voice low and fierce. You don't get to give up on us. The us hit Julian like a punch. He wanted to argue, to push Caleb away, but the truth was he couldn't imagine a world without him. Not anymore. They left under cover of darkness, the snow crunching under their boots. Caleb led the way, his hand brushing Julian's as they moved through the trees. The contact was fleeting but electric, a reminder of the bond that held them together. Even now, they found a new hideout in an abandoned hunting lodge deeper in the mountains. It was colder here, the air sharp with the promise of winter. As they settled in, Julian's dreams grew worse, blending with reality. He saw Caleb's face in both lives loyal, steadfast, bound to him in ways that broke Julian's heart. One night, unable to sleep, Julian found Caleb outside, staring at the stars. Do you ever feel it? Julian asked, his voice trembling. Like we've done this before. Caleb turned, his expression soft but serious. Sometimes, he admitted. But I don't care about then. I care about now. About you. The words were a lifeline, but they also terrified Julian. He stepped closer, close enough to feel Caleb's warmth. I don't want to hurt you again, he whispered. Caleb's hand found his, their fingers intertwining. Then don't, he said simply. Choose me this time. The moment hung between them, fragile and raw. Julian wanted to kiss him, to erase the past with the present. But the sound of an engine in the distance broke the spell. Caleb's grip tightened, his body shifting into protector mode. Get inside, he said, his voice all business. Julian obeyed, his heart pounding as Caleb disappeared into the dark. The wait was agony, each minute stretching into eternity. When Caleb returned, his face was grim. They're closer than I thought, he said. We can't stay here. As they packed, Julian's fear gave way to resolve. He couldn't change the past, but he could fight for their future. For Caleb. For them. The road stretched endless before them, a ribbon of asphalt cutting through the Adirondack wilderness. Julian gripped the wheel of the stolen truck, his knuckles white, while Caleb scanned the horizon, his gun resting on his lap. They were running again, but this time, Julian felt the shift wasn't just fleeing. He was fighting for something. Caleb's silence was heavy, his eyes flicking to the side mirror every few seconds. Julian wanted to say something, anything, to ease the tension, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he focused on the road, on the hum of the engine, on the man beside him who'd given up everything to keep him safe. They stopped at a gas station just before dawn, the neon sign flickering like a dying star. Caleb went inside to pay, his movements cautious, while Julian waited in the truck, his heart pounding. The dreams were relentless now, bleeding into his waking hours. He saw Caleb in chains, his eyes filled with a love Julian hadn't deserved. The guilt was a living thing, clawing at his chest. When Caleb returned, he slid into the passenger seat, his expression unreadable. We've got a problem, he said, holding up a crumpled flyer. Julian's face stared back at him, a grainy photo with the words, Wanted, Julian Kane, in bold. The bounty had doubled. Julian's stomach dropped. They'll never stop, he said, his voice hollow. My father won't let me go. Caleb's hand found his. A brief, grounding touch. Then we make him, he said, his voice fierce. We end this. The plan was reckless, desperate. Caleb's contact had a elitist safe house in Vermont, run by an old Marine buddy who owed Caleb his life. But getting there meant crossing state lines, dodging checkpoints, and trusting in luck they didn't have. Julian hated how much he was asking of Caleb, how much he'd already taken. As they drove, the tension between them grew, not from anger, but from something unspoken, something alive. Julian caught Caleb watching him, his blue eyes soft in a way that made Julian's chest ache. "What?" Julian asked, his voice barely above the engine's hum. Caleb hesitated, then spoke. "I keep thinking about what you said. About the dreams. About us." Julian's grip on the wheel tightened. "You think I'm crazy," he said, half joking, half fearing the truth. "No," Caleb said, his voice low. "I think you're right. I feel it too. Like I've been here before. With you." The confession hung between them, heavy and real. Julian wanted to pull over, to face Caleb, to say the things he'd buried for years. But the road demanded his focus, and the danger demanded their silence. They reached the Vermont border by nightfall, but the safe house was a bust crawling with Richard's men. Caleb spotted them first, his instincts kicking in as he pulled Julian behind a tree. "We're not going in," he whispered, his breath warm against Julian's ear. Julian's heart raced, not just from fear, but from Caleb's closeness. "Then where?" he asked, his voice shaking. Caleb's eyes met his, steady and sure. "Anywhere but here. Together." They backtracked, finding a motel off the highway, its neon sign buzzing faintly. Inside, the room was small, the air thick with the weight of their shared fear and unspoken desire. Julian sat on the bed, his hands trembling, while Caleb checked the locks. "I'm sorry," Julian said suddenly, the words spilling out. "For everything. For dragging you into this. For whatever I did to you before." Caleb turned, crossing the room in 2 strides. He knelt before Julian, his hands resting on Julian's knees. "You don't owe me an apology," he said. "You owe me a chance." Julian's breath caught. He reached out, his fingers brushing Caleb's cheek, the touch tentative but electric. Caleb didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned in, closing the distance, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like a promise, like absolution. For the first time, Julian felt free not from the danger, but from the past. Caleb was his anchor, his chain, his everything. And as they held each other in that dim motel room, Julian knew they'd face whatever came next together. The motel room was a cocoon, shielding them from the world for one fleeting night. Julian lay beside Caleb, their breaths mingling in the dark, the memory of their kiss still burning on his lips. For the first time, he felt the weight of both lives lift, if only for a moment. But dawn brought reality crashing back. Caleb was up first, checking the news on a burner phone. Julian watched him, the lines of his face etched with worry. "They're closing in," Caleb said, his voice grim. "Your father's offering more money than I thought possible." Julian's heart sank. Richard Kane's empire was a machine, relentless and unyielding. He'd never let Julian go, not because he loved him, but because Julian was his to control. The thought made Julian's skin crawl, stirring memories of that other life, where his need for control had caged Caleb just as cruelly. "We need to disappear," Caleb said, his eyes meeting Julian's. "New identities, new lives. My contact can help, but it's a risk." Julian nodded, but the fear was a living thing, clawing at his chest. "What if we can't?" he asked. "What if he finds us? Caleb's hand found his, strong and steady. "Then we fight," he said. "Together." They left the motel before sunrise, the truck's engine a low growl as they headed west. Caleb's plan was to reach a safe house in Ohio, run by a network of ex-Marines who owed him favors. But the road was fraught with danger checkpoints, drones, the constant threat of betrayal. Julian felt the weight of it all, the guilt of pulling Caleb deeper into his mess. As they drove, Julian's dreams bled into the present, vivid and unrelenting. He saw Caleb in that stone cell, his eyes filled with a love that broke Julian's heart. He saw himself, the prince, wielding power like a weapon, binding Caleb with chains of duty and desire. The parallels were too stark, the guilt too heavy. "I don't want to be him," Julian said suddenly, his voice breaking the silence. "The man I was. The one who hurt you." Caleb glanced at him, his expression soft. "You're not him," he said. "You're you. And I'm choosing to be here." The words were a balm, but they didn't erase the fear. They stopped at a diner for lunch, blending in with truckers and locals. Julian sat across from Caleb, their knees brushing under the table, the contact grounding him. He wanted to reach out, to hold Caleb's hand, but the world felt too dangerous, too watching. The attack came without warning. A black SUV pulled into the lot, and Caleb's instincts kicked in. "Move," he hissed, grabbing Julian's arm and pulling him toward the back exit. They slipped into the woods behind the diner, the sound of boots crunching behind them. Caleb led the way, his movements swift and sure, but Julian's heart pounded with every step. They hid behind a cluster of trees, Caleb's body pressed close, shielding him. The mercenaries passed within feet, their voices low and menacing. Julian held his breath, his hand gripping Caleb's, their pulses beating as one. When the danger passed, Caleb didn't let go. "We're okay," he whispered, his lips brushing Julian's ear. The intimacy of it sent a shiver through Julian, not from fear, but from something deeper, something alive. They reached the Ohio safe house by nightfall, a nondescript farmhouse surrounded by fields. Caleb's contact, a gruff ex-Marine named Maria, welcomed them with a nod and a warning. "You've got a week, maybe less, before they find this place," she said. "Make it count." That night, Julian couldn't sleep. He found Caleb on the porch, staring at the stars. "I keep thinking about what you said," Julian admitted, his voice soft. "About choosing you." Caleb turned, his eyes searching. "And?" Julian stepped closer, his heart pounding. "I choose you," he said, the words a vow. "In this life, in any life." Caleb's smile was small but real, and when he pulled Julian into his arms, it felt like coming home. They stood there, bound by something stronger than fear, stronger than the past. But the shadow of Richard Kane loomed large, and Julian knew their fight was far from over. The Ohio farmhouse was a fragile sanctuary, its walls creaking with every gust of wind. Julian sat at the kitchen table, watching Caleb and Maria map out their next move. The air was thick with tension, the weight of time running out. Richard Kane's men were closing in, and Julian's dreams were a constant reminder of the stakes. In those dreams, he saw Caleb's face, worn and weary, bound to him by chains Julian had forged. The guilt was a living thing, twisting in his chest. He'd caged Caleb once, and now, in this life, Caleb's love was the chain keeping Julian from breaking. The irony was cruel, but it fueled his resolve. Maria's voice cut through his thoughts. "We've got a way out," she said, spreading a map across the table. "Canada. A friend in Montreal can get you new papers. A fresh start. But you'll need to move fast. Caleb nodded, his eyes flicking to Julian. We can do this, he said, his voice steady. But it's your call. Julian's throat tightened. He wanted to run, to disappear with Caleb and leave the past behind. But Richard Kane wasn't just a manha, was a force, a shadow that stretched across their lives. What if he follows us? Julian asked, his voice barely audible. Caleb's hand found his under the table, a quiet reassurance. Then we face him, he said. Together. The plan was set. They'd leave at dawn, slipping across the border under cover of darkness. But as night fell, Julian's fear grew. He found Caleb in the barn, checking their supplies, his movements precise despite the exhaustion in his eyes. I'm scared, Julian admitted, his voice breaking the silence. Not just of my father, but of losing you. Caleb turned, his expression soft but fierce. You're not losing me, he said, stepping closer. Not in this life. The words were a promise, and Julian clung to them. He reached out, his fingers brushing Caleb's. And this time, he didn't pull away. Their kiss was desperate, hungry, a collision of fear and love that left Julian breathless. Caleb's hands were steady, grounding, binding Julian in a way that felt like freedom. But their moment was shattered by the sound of engines. Maria burst into the barn, her face grim. They're here, she said. We need to move. The night became a blur of chaos. Caleb grabbed Julian's hand, pulling him toward the truck as gunfire erupted. Maria covered them, her own weapon drawn, but the odds were against them. Julian's heart pounded as they ran, the darkness swallowing them. They made it to the truck, but the mercenaries were relentless, their vehicles closing in. Caleb drove, his focus razor-sharp, while Julian clung to the passenger seat, his mind racing. The dreams flashed before him: the prince, the guard, the cage. He couldn't let that be their story again. Turn left, Julian said suddenly, an instinct he couldn't explain. Caleb didn't question it, veering onto a dirt road that led into the woods. The mercenaries followed, but the terrain slowed them, giving Caleb and Julian a chance to lose them. They abandoned the truck deep in the forest, moving on foot. Caleb's hand never left Julian's, their breaths sinking in the cold night air. We're close, Caleb said, his voice steady despite the danger. Just a few more miles. Julian nodded, but his heart was heavy. He knew this wasn't just about escaping, it was about breaking the cycle, about choosing love over fear. As they moved through the trees, Julian made a silent vow he'd fight for Caleb, for them, no matter the cost. By dawn, they reached a small cabin, a temporary refuge. Caleb checked the perimeter, his gun at the ready, while Julian sank to the floor, exhausted. The dreams were quieter now, as if his choice had shifted something fundamental. He looked at Caleb, his protector, his love, and knew they were running out of time, but they were running together. The Canadian border was a whisper away, hidden beyond a frozen river and a stretch of dense forest. Julian stood at the edge of the ice, his breath visible in the dawn light, Caleb's hand steady in his. They'd made it this far, but the weight of their journey, both lives, pressed heavy on Julian's heart. The cabin had been a brief respite, but Richard's men were relentless. They'd found the truck's tracks, and now the sound of drones hummed faintly in the distance. Caleb's face was grim, his eyes scanning the horizon. We cross now, he said, his voice low but firm. No looking back. Julian nodded, but his mind was tangled in the dreams that had haunted him for months. In that past life, he'd been the captor, binding Caleb with chains of power and possession. Now, Caleb's love was the tether. But it wasn't a Khajiit, it was a choice. One Julian was finally ready to make. They moved across the river, the ice creaking under their weight. Caleb led, his steps careful but sure, his hand never leaving Julian's. Halfway across, the drones grew louder, and Julian's heart lurched as he spotted figures on the far bank, mercenaries, their weapons glinting in the early light. Caleb's grip tightened. "Keep moving," he whispered, his voice a lifeline. But the ice groaned, a crack splitting beneath them. Julian stumbled, his fear spiking, but Caleb pulled him up, their eyes locking for a fleeting moment. "I've got you," Caleb said, and Julian believed him. They reached the other side, scrambling into the trees as gunfire erupted. Caleb returned fire, his shots precise, buying them time. Julian's lungs burned as they ran, branches clawing at his face. But Caleb's presence was a constant, a shield against the chaos. They found cover in a shallow ravine, their breaths ragged. Caleb checked Julian for injuries, his hands gentle but urgent. "You okay?" he asked, his voice rough with worry. Julian nodded, his chest tight. "I'm sorry," he said, the words spilling out. "For everything. For then. For now." Caleb's eyes softened, but before he could respond, the sound of footsteps closed in. They were cornered, the mercenaries fanning out above them. Julian's heart pounded, the dreams flashing before him. Caleb in chains, his loyalty a curse. He couldn't let that be their end. "Stay down," Caleb said, his gun raised. But Julian grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "No," Julian said, his voice steady for the first time. "This time, we fight together." Caleb's eyes widened, but he nodded, a spark of pride in his gaze. They moved as one, using the terrain to their advantage, picking off the mercenaries with calculated precision. Julian's hands shook as he fired, but Caleb's presence steadied him, their bond a strength neither could deny. When the last mercenary fell, silence descended, broken only by their heavy breaths. They were alive, but the danger wasn't over. Caleb pulled Julian to his feet, their hands clasped tight. "We're almost there," he said. "Just a little further." They crossed the border under cover of dusk, a contact waiting with papers and a car. As they drove north, the weight of their pasts began to lift. Julian looked at Caleb, his profile sharp against the fading light, and felt a clarity he'd never known. In that other life, he'd caged Caleb with selfishness. In this life, Caleb's love had bound them both, not with chains, but with trust. Months later, they settled in a small coastal town in Canada, their new identities a fragile shield. Julian found work as a teacher, Caleb as a carpenter, their lives quiet but full. The dreams faded, replaced by memories of this life off stolen kisses, shared laughter, a love that had survived lifetimes. One evening, as they walked along the shore, Julian stopped, his hand in Caleb's. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For choosing me." Caleb smiled, his eyes bright with the same love that had carried them through. "Always," he said, pulling Julian close. They stood there, bound by choice, by love, by a future they'd fought for. The past was a shadow, but it no longer held them. In this life, they were free together,